Good. So I feel like a tagged dog here with this thing on my neck type thing, but it means I've got one less thing to coordinate. I was trying to think of a strap line for my involvement in this, and I kept coming up in my head with this image of Spike Milligan's book, my part in his downfall. But so what was my creative input into this? Oop. Well, the first thing to say is that it doesn't actually take a rocket scientist to know that this is a much better book than the first one. The first book was really groundbreaking. I mean, people we know in the USA, it sort of literally changed their worldview because it was the first book really to integrate what you might call sort of social and cultural concerns with nature. And rather than seeing these things like matter and antimatter, these things were actually, in many cases, what's good for us as human beings is also actually very good for wildlife too. We both use resources, and if you're an invertebrate, pollinating invertebrate, then actually the fact that we really like flowers as a species is really good news. So we can have our cake and eat it, so to speak. So, and the production values are better. The images. When we first, it's a funny old story, isn't it? But we ran a conference in Sheffield. We ran these big conferences to get our sort of agenda and our message out, from 2000 on. And we had sort of something like 500 people in this big lecture theatre at the university. The boxes came, you got a book with your registration. We hadn't actually seen, we opened the boxes and we looked at it and we looked at the pictures and they looked as if it'd been done with potato printing, so it was a little bit one of those gasp moments. Anyway, so that's all. Okay, so the new one I think is a much better sort of piece of work. And of course, we were babies then. I mean, in 2002, 2003, we'd really just beginning to find our way in the world, and we were coming at this from, quite a scientific point of view, but even back in the late 90s, we were beginning, I was beginning to road test some of this scientific work into practice. I did the Welsh National Botanic Gardens, I did the part of the Eden Project, and so on and so forth. So we were beginning to try and see, can these things work, which is absolutely terrifying, because my whole life has been about pushing boats out. And, it's a very scary business to innovate, to be the first, or one of the first. So anyway, 2000, we got the Olympic Park gig because of the book, even with its potato printing. Because it was a sort of worldview that seemed really sort of novel and forward-thinking and progressive. So it's exactly what John Hopkins, who was the commissioner for the landscape on the Olympic Park. So the book was really instrumental in this. So it let me manage the creation of 10 hectares of native wildflower meadows. And Nigel did a similar thing with the annuals. We created the concept for the Olympic Gardens. We did 2 of them each with Sarah Price. So that's sort of really, really exciting time. But then after having written the book in 2002 and 2003, published it in 2004, we then had another 20 years to sort of grow up and to do our thing. And, we were really busy. And we've done quite different things in a way, but as you'll see, but we were both incredibly busy. So I sort of disappeared a little bit in the UK from 2012. So I got sucked into China. I had a PhD student who was a terrifying woman. She's terrifyingly great. I mean, she was amazing. And I was sort of headhunted to do stuff in China. So for the next sort of 10 years, I was still making things here, creating things here, but my real presence was in China. I've been to China 55 times in 10 years, worked on dozens of projects, traveled hundreds of thousands of kilometers looking at nature in China, but not just China. I thought, after from 2012 on, I just thought, I've got 10 years and I really want to look at all of the world's interesting natural vegetation. And I want to feed that back into my thoughts about design. And I just thought, well, someone should do it. And it was a lot of fun. So I did it. And so here we are, Central Asia, Chinese primetime TV, just having designed this space at the Beijing Expo, crazy field trips with Thomas Stewart Smith, Pete Uldorf, Thomas Rayner, Cassian Schmidt, around Szechuan for 2 weeks. So I led this sort of crazy sort of life in a way. And what I'd like to think is that the things I have seen, it's given me this incredible opportunity to see things which many people have never actually seen before. And it's really sort of almost a sort of transcendental moment to do this. And so looking at nature, it's always been an powerful thing, but these 10 years really let me do it. And I hope that comes through in the new book, because I think that's really, really valuable. South Africa, I mean, hey, Bulbinella, because I've always been interested in the new, in innovating, in climate change. So Bulbinella, that's Bulbinella and the Great Karoo. It's in South Africa, but it goes -16 there. It's very, very cold. And yet, if you look through the literature, for example, I need to be careful at the RHS because I'm actually on their council now. I mustn't be too rude. Now I'm on the board. But, if you look at a lot of the literature today, it will tell you that those things can't grow in the UK. But they can. Absolutely. So it's really helpful in terms of just creating a sort of loosening up the picture a little bit. We made gardens. I mean, one of the projects in China, I became the person who got the Chinese interested in their native flora. And in one sense, they were always interested in native flora, but it was just a tiny little niche of a megaflora of 30,000 species. So I worked for the government, going around in front of a minibus through many parts of China saying, pink thing, stop. And then we'd all run up the hill, they would collect seed, it would go then into some nursery in Beijing, etc., etc. So this has given me really very much a world view, and I did this in China, I've done it in South Africa, I've done it in South America, I've done it in Australia. So I was busy during those 10 years, but still turning out, the odd project with Tom Stewart Smith and this sort of stuff, and writing the Sowing Beauty book in 2017, which was really, my equivalent to Nigel's work with annuals, but on perennial species. And we road tested lots of these things in China, crashed an awful lot. It wasn't always successful. I mean, it was a bit like Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, if you've ever seen that crazy movie. So this is in Beijing in 2019, and in these new landscapes that we were making, what we were trying to do is that just looks like some pretty Delphinium grandiflorum, doesn't it, with a rather stylish Tom Stewart Smith sort of shelter, the bamboo woven shelter, But the thing is about this is it's about trying to create new ideas. So this was as much as we could using native species, or obviously there are many species that are not native, climate adapted to the Beijing climate, which can be ferociously dry and hot, using deep gravel mulching to manage weeds, to using species which do not need irrigating. Now, to the Chinese, that was an extraordinary idea because they irrigated everything every week or every day, if they could. So we're always trying to innovate and to create new ideas. And I've continued that work in the UK, again, trying to work on some sort of horticultural edge, some cutting edge. So this is the net wilding garden, which I don't know if any of you have been to. It's the substrate is crushed concrete. So working on crushed concrete, the same ideas that Nigel's work with about using hostility as a positive, as a creative thing. So So these things have all, again, because we had the chance to completely rewrite this book, we've been able to put these learnings and these understandings that we've achieved from these things. I've learned a lot about crashing. Okay, so when you try to push the boat out, once you move away from what everyone else does, whether it's species or whether it's process, you will crash occasionally. That's just the risk. And of course, when I say crashing, what I really mean is with ecologically based vegetation, there's a lot more competition. Sometimes you do these things in sites where the management skills are not either there or sometimes they disappear. It's really interesting looking at the Olympic Park, isn't it? That's a project which when we did, it was absolutely, world leading in terms of its quality of the planting and everything. And, what typically happens in most sites, you get this race to the bottom to spend less and less and less. And everyone forgets about how good it was the year before, and you adopt a new reality which is far inferior, and you keep moving forward. So I think it's incredible, really, that, the incredible thing about the Greater Green is it's still good. Because that is sort of books the trend, and that is because Nigel's here, and Nigel pays a lot of attention to it, and because of the green estate. It's that combination of designer and management and the longer term view and the feedback that you get between the two. That's absolutely critical if these things are going to become realistic. So, going back to that, I would never have made that on a public site. No way. Because the chance of crashing would be so high with that. Because when you have a lot of self-regeneration from seed, on crushed concrete substrates, it's just like pushing the go button. And then the genie's out the bottle. And the tiger can go which way, the dragon, which way is it going to go? So, I was comfortable making that because Charlie Harper was there. Charlie Harper's a very skilled horticultural designer, maintainer. And I knew he would be able to handle it. So you have to really think about what's fit for who, where, when. And if you don't do that, it can be really problematic. So, and what I mean by crashing well, gently, and badly, because you always get change in naturalistic vegetation. It's simply part of the nature of the thing, as Nigel said a minute ago. And so, there's a gradient of how you will do. Crashing well is just perhaps having change. Crashing badly is when someone pulls it out, because it goes beyond the point to which they can retrieve it. So, the green estates, I'm in awe of you guys, how you held it together. I wandered around here before, and I thought really interesting how and it owns absolutely right. In Nigel too, it's this sort of vegetation. It's not high input, but it's input at critical points in time. So it's relatively low on resource input. It's relatively high on cognitive or intellectual thought in terms of what you do when. And that's the big cultural shift with this sort of vegetation. And it can work, but we have to find ways to make it work on a really regular basis. And this better integration of design management. Management is just design on a long time scale. But it's really hard for management because management is not so sexy. They don't produce wonderful sort of either sort of videos or plans. It's sort of invisible, the output and the skills. So getting a capitalist society to value something that doesn't seem to exist, it's easy to get people to want to value the designer equals the Mercedes, but much more difficult with the management. So we have to try and achieve a major shift in our societies, because this is the elephant in the room. We all know it, but we sort of just hope for the best. And we have to find interesting ways. I think some of the things that John Little's talking about at the moment, about trying to repurpose biodiversity net gain, to have the money which would normally restore some native ecosystem 200 miles up the road in some farmer's field, that those resources actually go locally to employ gardeners, to intensively manage the sorts of things we're all interested in locally. That's really got to be the way to go, or a way to go. I continue to make things. Don't get me wrong, I'm a very positive person. I'm very, very optimistic. I'm a natural-born optimist. This is a project in Melbourne, which Nigel and I are both involved in, called Lac Bundap. This is not the project. This is 250 square meters of test garden, in which this is a 9-year project. It's a $1.5 billion project to build a new art gallery on the back of another art gallery in the ballet school and the concert hall, right in the centre of Melbourne. And so what we've done is, with the other partners, it's a multi-headed partnership, we've created these test gardens just 200 metres away from where the real site is. And we run that, and we're really running a dummy. And we did pretty much the same at the Olympic Park. So this is the Olympic Park on 18,000 square metres of planting, rather than 100 hectares of landscape. But it's exactly the same process, and it's a 9 to 10-year project. We don't plant anything to 27, and we've been working on it since 2019. So, and it's to try and iron out all of these wrinkles and to be confident about the fitness of the plants and how we manage it and train. The head gardener's already been appointed. And there's nothing to garden yet except these little test squares. So these are the sorts of things. And again, this sort of, hopefully the wisdom that comes from this stuff is actually has fed into the book. I continue to do. This is my own garden in Sheffield. The S word, Somerset. That's where it is. And so I oscillate between being home gardener and doing things like Lac Bundap on this mega scale. Lac Bundap has 500,000 plants. It's a sort of mega sort of scale. But one of the great things about, I think we need to reappraise the sort of the value of gardens to people who design landscapes. And Nigel and I have always been very passionately interested in our own gardens. And it's just a fantastic way to road test your ideas, which no matter what you do with computer screens and 4B pencils, you can never really achieve. This is really, really, and the fantastic thing is, I control it. I don't have to defer my responsibility for this to some person I will never know or don't know, or who's not maybe motivated. So, because in my experience, all of the projects which really are successful, and all the projects I've ever been involved in which are really successful in the longer term, they always have someone who has the same motivation as I have in my own garden space. And the ones that are always bad is when you don't have that, and that's another elephant in the room, isn't it? And so in the book, I've tried to unpick a lot of these things. Again, I'm really interested in the idea of unpicking the invisible, things which are important but are not seen, and we all sort of know, but we don't know. So the introduction, I'm not going to do this for very long, because just read the bloody book. There's no point in me paraphrasing it. On page 3, I had this brilliant idea about, you can make your own decisions whether it was a good idea. But the introduction to me was the really most important part of this book. And I guess I led on this. Nigel contributed too, but I guess I led on it. And I led on the first one too. And it was really very difficult, because, you're trying to explain to people, you're trying to have a conversation with people about, why this book is different. And then you're trying to sort of pull together the pieces which you think are the framework that people are going to carry around in their heads when they're dipping into this sort of book. So yeah, things that are invisible but strategically critical. So one of these ideas that I try to unpick in the introduction is this sort of normalization of poverty. And I don't mean poverty in a economic sense. I mean sort of experiential poverty in cities. Now, Sheffield is a little bit ahead of the curve on all of this, but if you look at most cities in Britain, and of course the focus of the book is international. When I'm writing this chapter, I mean, I'm an Australian citizen. I spent quite a lot of I've worked in China, I worked in South America, all these sorts of things. You're trying to write a book in the totality of the world as much as you physically can. And I think one of these things, is this whole idea. Now, we're going into a climate change crisis, we're going into a biodiversity crisis, and yet our norms, our norms are often not fit for purpose. So if you look at any sort of set of plans from a landscape project in the UK, some master plan for planning permission, you look at it and one of the things you see straight away is the balance in most cases between green and grey is really not how you really want it to be in the 21st century. You've got a few token trees and a square of grass. And we're not, that, as far as I can see, that's not really increasing, even though we all know that that's not the way to go. And it's just, the difficulties of trying to actually, in the economic world we live in, how do you change that? It's really, really hard. But the first thing is to recognize that's a problem. In terms of species impoverishment, we still have these very tiny set, we know, one of the things we've learned over the last 20 years, we now know that diversity of species and the spatial complexity that creates is the main driver of animal biodiversity. Okay? So the modernists were the worst thing the planet ever had in terms of animal biodiversity support, and yet there's still a bit of a big bang of that out there. So diversity is really important. Complexity and diversity should be the mantra of what people who create vegetation in cities, that's what they should hold. And so this is one of the stories in the book about that. You keep coming back to that. It's not, as the modernist saw it, it's not like one is beautiful, less is not more, less is less. Let's not any bones about that. Like chair designers run the world. In terms of the experience offered, again, I look at so much stuff in cities and it's a relatively recent idea in landscape architecture that creating experience was important. But experience is what it's about. It's about what they feel, not about what the designers feel they're doing in terms of their peer group. So we really need to address those sorts of things too. Helen's work, and work like environmental psychology should become a central mantra of landscape architecture. Not, someone told me in the class that, when I was a student, that circular spaces are really bad. And so I'm going to tell you that. These sorts of things still happen. And normalization of poverty in terms of capacity to support biodiversity. So, we know cities are not intrinsically poor in wildlife. Why do you only get 17 birds in central London, 17 bird species? It's not because it's central London, it's just the structure of the vegetation we make is so impoverished there that only 17 birds can live in that stuff. You've got to start seeing the world through the eyes of the organism, the bird or the invertebrate, not our eyes. Maslow, one of the leading American ornithologists, he did a fascinating study about 20 years ago, what happens in subdivisions in the eastern USA. They come in, they strip out half the woodland, to create spaces to put the houses in, the bird population, the diversity of birds crashes. You come back 20 years later, when people have planted trees and shrubs and replaced the underscrub, which had been removed, the birds' diversity is back to what it was. It's a choice. We can do these things. And challenging the binary, we live in a world, don't we? And then when you write a book, it's really difficult about these sorts of things. The binary, what is good and what is bad. And, I think I do a lot of things which are good, but I do them in ways which some people think are bad. Does that make the good bad? There's all of these sorts of issues. No, I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say it, but, site preparation. I in my new site, I got a 2-acre field, which was a cow field. It was covered in docks, 100 million docks, really rank agricultural grasses. It's now a grassland with 50 native forb species in it, etc. But I used a herbicide to kill the competition. A lot of people come to my house, and there's many these days. I am a fallen angel. But you ask the linnets and the goldfinches, which comes in flocks of hundreds to feed on my seed in a rural landscape which is devoid of those species, and ask them whether I'm a falling angel. Get a different answer. So this is a real dilemma. It really is. And no one wants to talk about it because everyone's scared of being unfollowed. As I have had frequently to me, James, I once thought I've always looked up to you, but I realise now you're a false prophet and I'm going to unfollow you. Ah! Who gives a shit? So these are things of trying to build in strategies for increasing biodiversity, strategies for dealing with plants and climate change, strategies for making things happen well in practice, and that's often by better integrating management into design. I like these. A lot of the things we have to make decisions on, you need to sort of have strategies. You need to say, well, okay, that first option is to do this, and if we can't do that, the next best option is to do that, and then the next best. This is just from the book, so they're in there. The next one is to do that, and then you go down these food chains from the best to the worst. So I think I'm good the way my head's wired at actually thinking and trying to make these essentially decision-making trees. That's what they are. Okay. Well, I'm almost there. The rest, organising the text and chapters through an ecological but also cultural lens to try to improve insight. I've tried to do that in the chapters I've been involved in. And as an editor, I try and help other people do the same. This question of harms and benefits, you cannot do ecological good things without harming things. Unfortunately, it's a truism. And in natural systems, disturbance, the main driver of positive change in ecosystems, harms many organisms while simultaneously benefiting others. So, we need to have interesting conversations. Just coming to the end, the management chapter uses soil productivity as its key for organisation. People talk about fertility. So I decided when I wrote the management chapter and also wrote some of the other chapters, I could actually use the same basic key or language so they made sense when you looked at them. You've got to read the book to see it. But instead of talking about natural, semi-natural, cultural, these artificial categories that people have invented for, say, vegetation, productivity is a much more sensible key. So here we go, management nature like vegetation. It's got the same basic structure and organisation of categorisation based on productivity as, say, the herbaceous stuff does. Hopefully you will find that really helpful. It cuts through a lot of the bullshit. And I love these, so more of these, making decisions on management. This is just a graphic from the book. But, it's about saying, look, this is about how do you respond to seed rain coming into a landscape. All these plantings have seed rain. It's in the air, it's coming in from plants in the plantings, it's from in and it's from outside. It's the main driver of change in everything we ever make. Do you simply have a laissez-faire approach and just say, what happens, happens? Low on energy and effort, high on change. Not necessarily positive change. If you say, no, I'm going to try and control it, then you're into a whole can of worms, which you can work through. And I've done this a lot for every vegetation type in my chapters. I've produced these decision-making trees, and what you do, accelerating weed colonization and severe mollusk damage, collapse. The news is bad. But the news is bad if you don't make the right decisions at the right point in time. God's not looking after you. He's busy with other stuff. So it's really important that we do these sorts of things. So I think that's me. So I hope I haven't distressed you. But I've tried to deal with these things head on, and hopefully it'll be useful to you. So thank you.